This week in Linux, we have a brand new version of the Linux kernel with Linux 7.0. We also have some distro news to cover with an update from Bazzite and Gentoo, as well as a new distro that hit my radar called stillOS. Plus, we have some drama news to talk about with various Office suites, and AI tools are back in the news this week with Anthropic making some waves. All of this and more on This Week in Linux, the weekly news show that keeps you up to date with what's going on in the Linux and open source world. Now let's jump right into your source for Linux good news. Before we get started this week, I just wanted to address the clear changes in the visuals and also the delay of the show being released over the past couple of weeks. For those who are listening to the audio-only version, my set behind me has been taken apart and the bookcase now displays nothing. This is because I have been in the process of moving. So I had to take everything down, put it all back up, and it's taking some time. I hope next week we'll have some more stuff in there. And I also think it's about time I change things up in the background anyway, so it's going to have some different stuff. What you may ask is what is it going to be? And well, I have not decided yet. I will be posting some preview photos and videos to my patrons during the process, so if you're curious, consider becoming a patron by going to tuxdigital.com/membership. And recently, I was asked what my setup was like what hardware I use with Linux support and all that. And then I realized I have never made a video about my setup before, so I thought it might be fun to do one of those as I build it out. So I'm going to do that. But right now, I just have enough stuff to set up for this recording of this episode. And that's all. So I have quite a lot ahead of me and actually I have to take some of it back down because some of it I just put it up just to get the show done, and I need to kind of maneuver everything. And for those who are really good at noticing small details, even the microphone's on the wrong side of the camera. So it is what it is. There's a lot to stuff I have to do, but right now I have enough to do the show. So let's do the show. Linus Torvalds has announced the latest release of the Linux kernel with Linux 7.0. This is a very big release with a lot of improvements for file systems, hardware support, networking, and more. Now, when it comes to version numbers, there are many schemes for projects, and one of the most popular is called major minor bug, and that means the first number is reserved for big changes like the 7 in 7.0, or major releases, and the next number is for minor releases where something small is fixed or improved, and then finally the last set of numbers is for bug fixes and patches. In the case of the Linux kernel, none of that matters. The number chosen is completely arbitrary and means nothing. It's more of an incremental chronological system to just keep track of the progress. For a quick history lesson, the Linux kernel used to have a version scheme that had meanings to the order of the numbers, but then the 2.x series happened, and more specifically, the 2.6.x series happened, and then it was changed. Linux 2.0 was released in June of 1996, and then it wasn't until 2003 we got 2.6. The last update to that version was in 2011 with 2.6.39. Yes, that means 2.x series lasted 15 years. This is when Linus Torvalds decided that was enough of the versioning nonsense and changed the system to be incremented every 20 releases. This meant that 3.x, 5.x, and 6.x series all had 20 releases starting with 0 and ending at 19. The only exception to this was 4.x, which had 21 releases, and while not completely confirmed, I like to think it was so they could do the joke about 420. All right, so now that we've got that clear, 7.0 doesn't necessarily mean that it's a major release. But it is in fact a major release. So let's jump in. First up in this release is there's a new API for file I/O error reporting. File systems on Linux currently have no standard mechanism for reporting metadata corruption and file I/O errors to user space via fsnotify. Each file system deals with the problem differently, and error reporting is inconsistent or absent entirely. This release introduces a generic FS error infrastructure that gives file systems a standard way to queue metadata and file I/O error reports for delivery to fsnotify. Linux 7.0 also adds a new health monitoring feature for XFS. This release adds new functionality to deliver live information about file system health events to user space. This is done by creating an anonymous file that can be read for events by user space programs. Events like metadata health failures, file I/O errors, and major changes in file system state, like unmounting and shutdowns and stuff like that. In user space, a new daemon program is created that will read the event objects and initiate repairs automatically. This daemon is managed entirely by systemd and will not block unmounting of the file system unless repairs are ongoing. This release adds support for Clang language extensions, which enables statically checking that required context are active or inactive by acquiring and releasing user-definable context locks. An obvious application is lock safety checking for the kernel's various synchronization primitives and checking that locking rules are not violated. This can help detect bugs at compilation time. There's also better IOU ring support for filters, because due to its design, IOU ring doesn't play well with the system call filtering done by system calls like seccomp or seccomp. IOU ring supports filtering, but it's not really usable for these cases. This release adds support for filtering, which enables tighter control over what exactly a specific OP code may do. On top of that, support is added for per-task filters, meaning that any ring created with a task that has a per-task filter will get those filters applied when it's created. These filters are inherited across forks as well. Once a filter has been registered, any further added filters may only further restrict what operations are permitted. Linux 7.0 also extends OpenTree 2 to allow faster and simpler container setup. When creating containers, the setup usually involves using clone new ns via clone 3 or unshare, which copies the caller's complete mount namespace. After some tasks, the runtime will recursively umount the old mount tree, thereby getting rid of all the mounts. This can be wasteful and slow. This release extends OpenTree with a new OpenTree namespace flag similar to OpenTree clone, only the indicated mount tree is copied. Instead of returning a file descriptor referring to the mount tree, it will cause the OpenTree to return a file descriptor to a new mount namespace. In that new mount namespace, the copied mount tree has been mounted on top of a copy of the real root fs. This allows OpenTree namespace to function as a combined unshare, clone new ns, and a pivot root. This release also has better swapping performance with swap table. As part of the long-term effort to improve the swapping performance, which started in version 6.18, this release includes the code corresponding to the phase 2 of the swap table, which aims to clean up and speed up swapping code. The Linux kernel added experimental support for ACC-ECN in 6.18 after some work done in previous releases. Now this release of 7.0 finally enables it by default. Explicit congestion notification, or ECN, is a mechanism where devices can mark IP packets instead of dropping them to indicate congestion to the endpoints. But this was originally specified in such a way that only one feedback signal can be transmitted per round trip time, or RTT. ACC-ECN, or RFC 9768, is a scheme that provides more than one feedback signal per RTT in the TCP header, which can be used to provide better TCP congestion handling, which is a much better improvement for networking. This release of Linux 7.0 also adds support for a new tree in the Btrfs file system. This is a logical remapping tree, which will in the future act as a layer of indirection when doing I/O. When doing relocation rather than fixing up every tree, the file system will record the old and new addresses in the remap tree. This will make things more reliable and flexible, as well as enabling some future changes Btrfs devs would like to make, such as larger data extents and reducing write amplification by removing copy on write only metadata items. And last, but certainly not least, there's one thing I wanted to tell you about that's coming in this latest version of Linux 7.0, and that is, well, for all of you Rock Band 4 guitar owners for the PS4 and PS5, those are now supported with Linux 7.0. There's also a whole lot more in this latest release of Linux 7.0. I didn't talk about all the networking stuff. There's even more, and there's just a ton. I'll have links in the show notes for anyone who'd like to learn more about the latest release and what is in the changelog. AI is getting uncomfortably good at finding software bugs, and Anthropic's Project Glasswing is one of the clearest signs yet that this is about to reshape security in a big way. The idea is simple but serious. If AI systems can uncover hidden vulnerabilities and even help turn them into working exploits faster than humans, then defenders need to start using those same tools before attackers do. The biggest news is not just that Anthropic built a stronger bug hunting model, but that it is trying to turn that capability into a defensive coordination effort before similar, more malicious capabilities spread broadly. Project Glasswing gives select partners and 40 plus additional critical software organizations access to Claude Mythos Preview to scan their own systems and important open source dependencies. Anthropic's core claim is a bit aggressive. They say that Mythos Preview can surpass all but the most skilled humans at finding and exploiting software vulnerabilities. And they also said that they have found thousands of high severity bugs, including in every major operating system and every major web browser. That is the real landscape shift here. Bug finding and exploit development capability is moving from elite specialists toward model-assisted workflows. Anthropic says this is not a narrowly trained exploit model, but an emergent result of better general code, reasoning, and agentic autonomy. That matters because it suggests that capability may keep improving as general models improve, even without explicit exploit-specific training. The Project Glasswing structure shows how vendors think the response has to change. Not just another company selling another security product, but a shared early access program, which is going to be involving AWS, which is Amazon Web Services, Apple, Broadcom, Cisco, CrowdStrike, Google, JP Morgan Chase, the Linux Foundation, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Palo Alto Networks. Anthropic is also putting up to $100 million in usage credits and $4 million in open source security donations. One of the clearest takeaways is that the AI finds bugs story has now crossed into AI finds bugs that were hiding in hardened software for years. Anthropic highlights a now patched 27-year-old OpenBSD bug, a 16-year-old FFmpeg vulnerability, and multi-bug Linux kernel exploit chains that reached root. Now, the OpenBSD one is a very interesting thing because OpenBSD is known for being like the most hardened security operating system ever. So finding this kind of thing is a big deal. Mythos Preview found a 27-year-old vulnerability in OpenBSD, which has a reputation as one of the most security-hardened operating systems in the world and is used to run firewalls and other critical infrastructure. The vulnerability allowed an attacker to remotely crash any machine running the operating system just by connecting to it. Now, the FFmpeg example is a really good example for explaining why this is unsettling, because it discovered a 16-year-old vulnerability in FFmpeg, and in a line of code that automated testing tools had hit 5 million times without ever catching the problem. So yeah, what this implies, these models may be especially useful at finding subtle logic or context-sensitive flaws that high-volume automated testing misses. This is not just faster fuzzing. The scary part is that these models appear to reason through weird edge cases that brute force testing can hammer for years at without getting it. Now, there's some hype around the Linux kernel story related to what they found, and it's not great, but there's more nuance to it than the hype suggests. Anthropic does say Mythos found kernel vulnerabilities and chained them into working privilege escalation paths, but the Red Team post also says that after several thousand scans, Mythos was unable to exploit many individual kernel bugs directly because of Linux's defense in depth, and instead succeeded by combining multiple primitives. So Linux did not just fold over here. The bigger story is that the layered defenses still matter in Linux, but AI is getting much better at stitching smaller bugs together into a compromise. Anthropic also argues that real near-term danger is not only 0 days, but N days, because once a patch exists, an attacker can use the patch to do as a roadmap and ask the model to turn it into a working exploit much faster than before. So the patch gap may become the panic zone, because the time between a fix landing and criminals weaponizing it could be getting smaller. On the benchmark side of things, Anthropic's public Glasswing page says Mythos Preview scored 83.1% on CyberGem vulnerability reproduction versus 66.6% for Claude Opus 4.6. While the Red Team blog separately describes large practical gains on exploit generation tasks and patched target testing. The important caution here is that the benchmark numbers and the anecdotal case studies are different measurements, so they should be not blended together as one single score or anything like that. But it is concerning. This announcement also fits into a broader shift that was already underway. DARPA's AI Cyber Challenge showed that autonomous cyber reasoning systems can find and patch vulnerabilities in critical open source software, and OpenSSF has since brought OSS CRS, which is Cyber Reasoning Systems, in as an open framework for running LLM-based bug finding and bug fixing systems. That means Glasswing is part of a larger movement, not a one-off Anthropic stunt. Now, the open source angle is where the strategic debate gets interesting. Anthropic and the Linux Foundation frame Glasswing as a way to give maintainers access to capabilities that were previously concentrated inside large companies. But critics immediately raise the risk of platform lock-in if critical defensive work becomes dependent on a proprietary model. That wouldn't be ideal. OpenSSF's OSS CRS work is relevant to that lock-in debate because it is explicitly trying to standardize how autonomous bug finding and bug fixing systems run across environments and even combine multiple CRSs together. And something important to note is that the OpenSSF says human review is still necessary because in one reviewed set of 630 AI-generated patches, 20 to 40% were semantically incorrect despite passing automated validation. So the security landscape change is not AI replaces security engineers. It's more closer to like AI massively increases the volume and speed of finding and exploiting attempts and patch proposals, which raises the value of good human triage. So AI can now flood the zone with findings and even plausible fixes, but maintainers still need to separate the genuinely secure patch from the patch that only looks correct to automation. The bottom line is basically this. Project Glasswing is an early attempt to keep AI-driven vulnerability discovery from becoming a pure attacker advantage by putting frontier-level bug finding and exploit capabilities in the hands of defenders first. But it also signals that the old security timeline, discover, patch, eventually exploit later, is breaking down pretty fast. Linux just crossed a major milestone in the gaming world that many people thought would be unheard of not that long ago. Linux has now smashed the 5% threshold in Valve's Steam hardware survey for the first time ever. On its own, this is a notable number, but the bigger story is what it says about Linux gaming in general. Because this is no longer just a niche desktop OS for hobbyists and enthusiasts like myself, thanks to Steam Deck, SteamOS, Proton, and the continued unforced errors by Microsoft, making so many people hate Windows 11, Linux is clearly growing. Linux reached 5.33% in Valve's March 2026 Steam hardware and software survey, up to 3.1% from over month to month, which is the first time Linux has cleared 5% in ever, easily its highest recorded Steam market share to date. And the 5.33% number is real, but the March spike also looks like a survey correction, not just millions of people suddenly installing Linux overnight. Valve's March survey shows English jumping to 39.09%, while simplified Chinese fell to 22.75%. And Gaming on Linux explicitly notes February had swung downward during a rise in simplified Chinese users. That means that 5.33% milestone is real in the published data, but the size of the jump likely overstates the month-to-month growth in the actual adoption. Now, even with the caveat, crossing 5% on Steam matters a lot because Steam is not a generic desktop metric. It is one of the most relevant samples in the world for PC gaming. For game developers and publishers, this is the kind of threshold that starts moving Linux from nice-to-have territory toward big enough to consider compatibility. The Steam Deck connection is visible in the survey itself. When filtered to Linux only, SteamOS is the single biggest Linux version at 24.48%. Now, Linux gaming is growing and growing, and it's been a really big experience for people who are switching to their desktop stuff with Linux. But also, let's be clear, Valve has turned Linux into the operating system behind one of the most important handhelds in PC gaming with the Steam Deck. So there's a significant amount of SteamOS users in that sense. Another reason the 5% mark matters is relative size. In the same March 2026 Steam survey, macOS was 2.35%. So Linux was more than twice macOS on Steam that month. That doesn't necessarily mean that Linux is bigger than macOS on the desktop because, most people don't use macOS for gaming, but it does show Linux is now substantially more relevant in the gaming side of things than it used to be. In the long term, this milestone matters because Linux gaming used to hover around roughly 1% on Steam. And now, Even a bad month is still a good one because it's above that older baseline. The trend line is that Linux gaming has moved from a niche curiosity to a meaningful platform, albeit a minority platform, but is still a meaningful platform. Linux passing 5% on the Steam survey is a fun stat, but it's also a sign that Linux gaming has moved into a completely different tier of relevance. This is a kind of milestone that shows years of work on SteamOS, Proton, and the broader Linux gaming ecosystem are paying off. It makes it much harder for the industry to keep treating Linux like an afterthought. So let's keep going. I have a new Linux distro to tell you about, and it's called stillOS. And fun fact, it's actually made by the editor of this show, Cameron. So stillOS is a new distribution designed to be as consumer ready as possible. Essentially, if you ever want to give someone a Linux PC and don't want to worry about it breaking, stillOS aims to be the distro for that. They aim to achieve this by building on top of Alma Linux, which is a community rebuild of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or RHEL, and then using fully automatic bootc atomic updates with a read-only file system rather than a package manager to prevent dependency conflicts. This is similar to Linux distros like Fedora Silverblue or the Universal Blue images like Bazzite and how they're working, but it's based on Alma Linux instead of Fedora. stillOS also comes with a customized version of GNOME that defaults to a much more familiar layout inspired by Windows rather than vanilla GNOME's layout that can have a learning curve, as you will. There's also an interesting tool called Still Control that comes with stillOS. Still Control comes with a layout switcher, allowing you to change the layout to one of 13 different variations based on your user interface preferences. You can then customize other aspects of the layout with the dock and the panel without touching GNOME extension settings. Although, if you do want to install GNOME extensions, you can. There is a GNOME extension manager that can grab extensions from GNOME's extension repo straight from Still Control. Another feature is native web app integration, where web applications can integrate into the system with dynamically colored header bars that match both GNOME and the web app for seamless integration. Some web apps are part of the ecosystems which allow these web apps to launch each other. For example, the Google Drive web app shares your Google login with the Google Docs web app, and opening a Google Doc inside Drive will make the document open in the Docs web app rather than the Drive web app itself. The goal here is to provide a stopgap for common applications that prevent some people from switching by replacing them with a web variant that feels somewhat native. The idea here is new Linux users searches for Microsoft Office and the Software Center, and instead of being disappointed that it doesn't exist, then they research on how they could get it through Wine or whatever. They get a Microsoft Office web suite that feels closer to a native experience than a regular web app would. stillOS ships a modern Linux stack, including Flatpak, Wayland, and bootc. However, some legacy apps may have problems with this stack, including Flatpak permission issues, Wayland issues, or needing to edit files that are read-only on stillOS. Their solution is a curated software center with each app tested on stillOS and given a still rating between bronze, silver, gold, and gold plus. Now, for those who are curious why it goes from bronze, silver, gold, and gold plus rather than something like platinum or diamond after gold, it's because gold is basically like the gold standard. So the gold plus means that it's somewhat better, but gold is still good enough. So it's not necessarily saying that, look for diamond or whatever. Basically, gold or gold plus are going to be a really good experience. And that's why there's a slight difference between the gold and gold plus rather than having a bigger difference between gold and diamond, for example. Some apps may be rejected if they do not work on the system. It's marked as like a low effort app if it's got like a buggy AI generated app, but not necessarily AI code, but more of like vibe coded, that sort of thing. Or its basic stock app for another desktop like KDE on GNOME, just to prevent beginner users from accidentally installing and using like KDE calculator on a GNOME desktop when they could just use the GNOME calculator. Now, that's not to say that KDE apps in general would be categorized this way. It's just like stuff that are built into the desktop for GNOME. You don't need another one that would be KDE, for example, like the KDE calculator versus the GNOME calculator. But if it was something like Kdenlive or something like that, then it would be, you'd be able to get that. And like I mentioned earlier with the web app integration, there's also a list of many pre-made web apps that are available in the store. Another thing stillOS ships is a tool called Quick Setup, which on the first boot lets the user pick their preferred web browser and lets you pick any apps you may need for your work, like from a curated set of both native Linux apps and web apps. It's basically like a welcome screen, but more specific in that sense. This serves as a discovery tool for new users to find apps for their work and also let power users get up and running very quickly. Finally, stillOS is designed to eliminate a need for terminal for fixing or maintaining your system. But they did build a new terminal from scratch for programmers or power users who want to use a terminal to get their work done rather than tinker. The main feature of Still Terminal is easy integration of both DistroBox and SSH profiles. DistroBox profiles can be created through an easy GUI, allowing you to run containers for other distributions on stillOS, including packages made for other distributions. And each container by default uses a color matching the distribution you are using, so you know what environment you are in for that particular app. SSH containers can be added to, accessed just by opening the container and given custom colors such as bright red for a production environment so you know not to run dangerous commands or stuff like that, or blue for testing environment where you can run dangerous commands if you want to. So if you are looking for a distribution that aims to be a consumer-ready Linux distro, then check out stillOS. Bazzite has released its April 2026 update, bringing some improvements while they gear up for the Bazzite 44 release based on Fedora 44. This update brings the 6.19.10 OGC kernel, or the Open Gaming Collective kernel, as well as Mesa 29.0.4. Bazzite images also now have SBOMs, or Software Bill of Materials, for update changelogs. A lot of image storage has been saved thanks to moving QEMU and ROCm support to the Bazzite DX image, which saves 1 GB of storage on the base image. A new rechunker for the images further shrinks the image size with Chunka. That's a fun name. I like that. And ZSTD compression coming soon for even smaller images. There's now support for steering wheels through additional drivers, as well as new built-in support for Elgato 4K capture cards. ASUS Control, or ASUS CTL, also lets you get the latest and greatest ASUS Linux patches. And also Subshine has been removed from the base image, but can now be installed through UJust using Brew. They say their main focus right now is game mode / handheld / HTPC images. These are undergoing major changes and improvements to sync them with what SteamOS is shipping, and some upcoming improvements include an open gamepad UI-based overlay for options not exposed through Steam, accurate changelogs displayed directly in the Steam Update UI, a smoother update experience in game mode, updated game scope with fixes from OGC, TDP control now able to manage through the Steam UI, and of course bug fixes for the Legion Go 2 and other new handhelds thanks to Input Plumber. Now the next release should be pretty soon because Bazzite 44 is being based on Fedora 44, and Fedora 44 should be coming out sometime this month. So there's going to be a lot of changes coming with that release, with a new version of KDE Plasma, a new version of GNOME, and many, many other things. So we'll cover that when it comes out later this month. There is some big news coming out of France because France is now putting Linux desktop migration inside an official state sovereignty push, with the French government's digital directorate saying it is exiting Windows in favor of Linux workstations as part of a broader plan to reduce extra European digital dependencies. That is what makes this bigger than an ordinary migration story. It is being framed as a strategic state decision, not just an IT refresh. France's National Digital Directorate, or DINAM, which is the organization in France responsible for managing the French government's IT infrastructure, has announced that it is moving its workstations from Windows to Linux. The Linux move is only one part of a much wider sovereign tech effort as well. They've also made an announcement that says every ministry, including operators, must formalize its own plan by autumn 2026 across desktop operating systems, collaboration tools, antivirus, AI, databases, virtualization, and network equipment. That means this is not a one-off desktop swap, but part of a whole government dependency reduction plan. Now, France is not starting from zero. The state already has a sovereign collaboration stack under Le Suite, including TChap for messaging, Visio for video conferencing, and France Transfer for file sharing. All presented as state-controlled or France-hosted tools. That matters because migrations to and from any operating systems are more realistic when the tools being used are also migrated or replaced. There's already visible scale behind these tools. Le Suite says that TChap is used by 600,000 public agents, and the French state is announced that the National Health Insurance System is migrating 80,000 agents to the government collaboration stack. That suggests that this is not just ideological positioning. France is already moving large public sector user bases onto their homegrown alternatives. So this is a big win for Linux. And Linux wins differently here when governments get involved because they're stopped viewing it as a niche OS and start treating it as a leverage against locked-in dependencies. And another reason is that this story is kind of like a symbolism thing because governments have a long history of talking about open source in principle while keeping Microsoft-centric workflows in practice or variety of other proprietary software involved. France publicly naming an exit from Windows is the kind of signal that can influence procurement conversations elsewhere in Europe. Now, the practical challenge is that the announcement is still a policy directive, not a full technical rollout plan or anything. The official statement does not identify the Linux distribution, migration phases, support model, legacy app strategy, hardware refresh plan, or final completion date. So while the announcement is real, the execution details are still in flux. Now, that missing detail is important because the hardest part of government desktop migrations is rarely installing the OS. It is replacing entrenched workflows, ensuring document compatibility, retraining staff, handling line of business apps, and maintaining political patience over multi-year transitions. This is where many past public sector migrations have struggled. Switching the operating system is the headline, but switching the habits, applications, and procurement dependencies is the actual battle. The strongest takeaway is that France has elevated Linux into a matter of public state sovereignty. And that's a real milestone. So recently there's been some drama happening in some open source office suites. First of all, we're going to talk about the fork, the European fork of ONLYOFFICE, which is called EuroOffice. European companies including IONOS or Ionis, Nextcloud, Eurostack, and more are forking ONLYOFFICE into a new open source suite called EuroOffice. This is a European effort meant for European organizations and governments as part of Europe's current effort to move off of non-European tech. The GitHub repo for EuroOffice states that, and I'll be quoting a lot here from the GitHub, so when I'm done with the quotes, I'll say end quote. They say that EuroOffice liberates the ONLYOFFICE code base. They say it forked it because contributing to ONLYOFFICE is impossible or greatly discouraged. ONLYOFFICE typically does not review or accept pull requests. Build instructions are unreliable, outdated, or just plain broken. They also go on to say that the company regularly makes controversial decisions like closing all features in the mobile apps like mobile editing and the removal of the administrator panel. They also say that the mobile apps are not really open source, but just wrappers. An example they gave is that the apps have extensive proprietary sections which will need to be re-implemented. Work on this is underway. They also talk about a lack of transparency. They say that commit messages, when visible, often just refer to an issue number in an internal issue tracker. There are quite a number of binary blobs and compiled or obfuscated code blobs. Most internal code comments are Russian, which makes it hard to work with. They also go on to say that ONLYOFFICE is a Russian company, despite many attempts to hide this, and nearly all developers reside in Russia. Open source is a global effort, but current political situation makes collaboration hard and trust difficult to earn, especially when development is not transparent and open. A lot of users and customers require software that is potentially influenced or controlled by the Russian government. Now, to clarify something, this is not for typical desktop office software like LibreOffice, but instead it's a web-based collaborative office suite that can be integrated into other products like Nextcloud. Now, there are desktop editors with ONLYOFFICE, but that's not what this is referring to. They did say, though, that there is a fork of the ONLYOFFICE desktop editors that they're working on. So this could change, but we'll see. Now, ONLYOFFICE is clearly not happy about this, so they did respond to this fork by flagging license violations by Nextcloud and Ionos. ONLYOFFICE says that ONLYOFFICE is distributed under the GNU Affero General Public License, or the AGPL v3, alongside additional requirements designed to ensure transparency and fair attribution. These include preserving ONLYOFFICE branding in derivative works, providing proper attribution to the original technology, fully complying with open source distribution obligations. These conditions are not optional. They are a fundamental part of using the software legally and ethically. End quote. Now, it's important to note that the ONLYOFFICE company has responded to the Russian-related stuff, saying that ONLYOFFICE is an international open source office suite developed as part of a global software project. Intellectual property rights for ONLYOFFICE are owned by Essentio System SIA, a company registered in Riga, Latvia. Ascensio System SIA operates as a subsidiary of OnlyOffice Capital Group Pte. Limited, a holding group registered in Singapore. All core intellectual property related to OnlyOffice has consistently been held in Latvia since the company's establishment. The group operates through an international corporate structure spanning multiple jurisdictions, and CEO Lev Banov holds dual citizenship, including Russian and Turkish, and has been residing in Istanbul, Turkey since 2023. End quote. It is kind of interesting that a lot of people are talking about they're not accepting pull requests and code submissions. Well, technically, to be open source, you don't have to do that. It's not a requirement. As long as you provide the source code, it is open source. You don't have to be allowing pull requests or being community involved in that sort of sense. If you want to do it just as a company and not accept pull requests, you can do so and still technically be open source. I don't know why you would want to, because one of the most powerful reasons to be open source is to allow other people to contribute code, but it is technically okay. Now, to be clear, I am not a lawyer, but I did want to point out one thing that's related to this lawyer's opinion, because they put a lawyer's opinion. They don't say which lawyer or anything like that. I can't see that, but they do have it here, and it says, pursuant to Section 7 of AGPL v3, the copyright holder is expressly entitled to impose additional conditions in the case of OnlyOffice. Such conditions include, in particular, the obligation to retain the original product logo, the denial of any rights to use the copyright holder's trademark. So this seems like kind of like a contradiction in a sense, though, because if you're required to include the original product logo, but that product logo is trademarked by the company that the logo is from, then how are you supposed to fork it? That just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, also, I'm not really sure if AGPL allows for additional clauses like they're claiming. It might. I haven't looked at it myself to dig through all of the details to see if it does allow that. But it is interesting that those two things are there, because those conditions seem like they're contradictions to each other. Anyway, so there's a lot more to be discussed on this topic, a lot more than I have time for to cover in this show. Maybe I'll make a video specifically about this to go into more depth about the AGPL and that sort of thing, because it does require a lot more time put into it to, kind of decipher what it means versus what they're saying it means, and, that kind of thing. But also, it is worth noting that OnlyOffice also suspended their partnership with Nextcloud over this. You may have used OnlyOffice before inside of Nextcloud, so maybe expect that to go away, or EuroOffice to show up at some point. We'll see what happens. That said, OnlyOffice says they will continue to support and develop the OnlyOffice connector for Nextcloud due to customers relying on it for integration purposes. So this is a pretty complicated topic. Like I said, there's going to be a lot more details that I would need to research and that sort of thing to really fully give you a full breakdown of this kind of thing. So be sure to subscribe to the channel and look out for a video where I try to decipher everything that's related to this. I don't know how long it's going to take, but it is an interesting topic, and we'll see where it goes. There's some drama going on between the Document Foundation, which develops LibreOffice, and Collabora. The Document Foundation has mass ejected over 43 contributors who were employed by or partnered with Collabora, one of LibreOffice's biggest corporate contributors. Before this, Collabora was responsible for 45% of all commits to LibreOffice, with 7 of the top 10 all-time core contributors to LibreOffice being Collabora employees. Collabora states that these ejections were based on unproven legal concerns and guilt by association. Collabora Productivity CEO Michael Meeks also took aim at government decisions they consider indefensible, including favoring non-technical staff over experienced contributors and reviving a shelved LibreOffice Online version, which directly competes against Collabora's online Office suite. And again, keep in mind, Collabora is the biggest contributor of LibreOffice, our biggest single contributor with 45%. And also, ItsFoss reports that not only is Michael Meeks the CEO of Collabora Productivity, but also one of the founders of the Document Foundation. So it does seem a bit odd for this to kind of happen, especially considering it was posted on April 1st. And no, it's not an April Fool's joke, apparently. Apparently, there are also legal proceedings against former volunteer board members, and these proceedings are bankrolled by donor money, yet others misusing the LibreOffice name are not getting any pushback. The Document Foundation gave a short response stating this is due to newly adopted community bylaws that require contributors to step down if they are in active legal dispute against the Document Foundation, though it is unclear what the legal dispute is. They also make it clear that membership revocation is not a ban from contributing. So it gets a bit more muddy here because later the Document Foundation did a longer response where they admitted to mistakes of granting free use of the LibreOffice brand to those selling the software in Microsoft and Apple app stores and awarding essentially bug bounties to companies with representatives also on the Document Foundation Board of Directors. These mistakes were against nonprofit law, which then Board of Directors members were voting against fixing in their own interests. TDF was at risk of losing nonprofit status because of the conflicts of interest from board members. Meeks called this post misleading, defamatory, and factually incorrect when responding to it in an update to his original post. This situation is being compared to the OpenOffice crisis in the early 2010s, where Oracle's mismanagement essentially, well, actually purposefully, some people say, killed the project entirely and led to the Document Foundation being created to develop LibreOffice. The timing is especially rough given that European governments have been betting big on LibreOffice as part of their push away from non-European software. And this is a bit of a complicated topic, another complicated topic with a little bit of drama. It's not in the sense of OpenOffice because OpenOffice was essentially put out as in like intended to be ended, and then LibreOffice came out from that. This is more of like one party said this, the other party said that, and there's some stuff that happened that kind of muddies the situation. So we're going to have to look at this later on and see what happens because I highly suspect that this topic is a developing story. So we'll cover it again in the future when more information comes out about it because I doubt this is the end of it now. So we'll see what happens. The Session messaging app is having some funding problems. For those who don't know, this is a fork of Signal, and it uses the onion routing for messages, as well as not requiring a phone number or email. So this makes it very difficult to link someone to their messages. So if privacy is the utmost importance to you, then Session is a really interesting messaging app. The Session Technology Foundation sent out a call for help to gain additional funding. All paid developers have been let go, with Session only being ran by volunteers. And as a result, development has been paused, so no new features will be released and bug fixes may not be immediately fixed. With employees gone, they had enough money to run until July 8th, which was 90 days from the original post date. They're saying they need $1 million to launch Protocol V2, which adds forward secrecy, post-quantum encryption, and better device management, as well as a Session Pro subscription service, hoping to make the project self-sustaining. They say that once those things are complete, the project could stand on its own. There was also a personal appeal from the co-founder of Session, Chris McCabe, and him asking for people to consider funding the project. As of this recording, they have raised $95,000 of the $1 million they're looking to. So this is a significant difference between what they're looking for and what they have. So if you are a Session user and you want to help this project, then be sure to donate. You can go to getsession.org/donate to learn how to do that. As a news guy, I'm not a big fan of the April Fool's stuff that we do as a society because it is a lot of stuff that is either things that are not funny or things that you would want to be true, but then they make them and then they like, haha, isn't that funny? Like, no, I want this to be true, that kind of thing. But sometimes there are some funny April Fool's jokes, and Gentoo did a pretty good one because they announced that they were going to be switching from Linux to GNU Hurd as their primary kernel. The next day, the announcement, they changed that. Actually, they are doing something with GNU Hurd, but not that. So it is kind of cool because they're making a port of Gentoo to work on GNU Hurd. So this is very experimental. However, you can try it through QEMU if you want to, or run it on real hardware using some scripts that they have developed, because they've actually got it showing a demo of it running on a very old Dell computer with GNU Hurd. So this is pretty interesting. And for those who don't know, GNU Hurd was a project started by GNU to build their own Unix kernel. And by the way, this started before Linux did. Originally, the idea is to ran You ran this plus the core utils, and you got a fully open source Unix system. However, eventually the GNU project just moved to using mostly Linux, and the vast majority of the Linux distributions, while using GNU utils, are still using the Linux kernel. So for a long time, GNU Hurd was not even worked on and was kind of abandoned by 2010. But it has been picked up, and it is kind of getting some work done, and there is movement going on. So anyway, this is a fun thing to see that Gentoo is doing it because, why not? Let's give it a shot, see how it works. Thanks for watching this episode of This Week in Linux. If you like what I do here on the show and want to be kept up to date with what's going on in the Linux and open source world, then be sure to subscribe. And of course, remember to like that smash button. If you'd like to support the show and the Tux Digital channel, then consider becoming a patron by going to tuxdigital.com/membership. We're going to get a bunch of cool perks like access to the patron-only section of our Discord server and much, much more. You can also support the show by ordering the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt or the This Week in Linux shirt at tuxdigital.com/store. Plus, while you're there, check out all the other cool stuff we have like hats, mugs, hoodies, and more. tuxdigital.com/store. I'll see you next time for another episode of your source for Linux GNews. Thanks again for watching. I'm Michael Tennell. I hope you're doing swell. Be sure to ring the notification bell. And until next time, I bid you farewell.